بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to hear from you. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the indigenous people of the land here and finding ourselves with the grace of God on this beautiful land, Australia. And thank you very much for coming to the Parliament and obviously giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm going to touch the topic as briefly as possible from an Islamic perspective and sort of look at this issue of overconsumption specifically and look at 5 specific things that the Islamic tradition speaks of in relation to our responsibilities, our responses, and our relationships that we have with the environment, with the creation. And I prefer to use the word creation over environment because sometimes environment can be reduced to trees and plants. I'm wanting to speak of creation as a whole in our relationship to everything, including the stones out there. Firstly, the first point is this aspect of creation. What does Islam say about its purpose? And in the ecology and climate change discussion, sometimes it's seen as something that actually provides for us. And then we have the stewardship and sometimes this attitude of our dominance over the creation. And that idea is now changing and being reinterpreted in many faith-based discussions. However, Islam says that in fact that's not its purpose. That is one of the wisdoms that come out of the creation. But the first and foremost purpose and objective is, in fact, for it to be pointing to the Creator. The creation points to the Creator, and it's a sign. And as an example, as an analogy of signs, that if I was coming from Sydney, I'm from Sydney, by the way, and given this is an international arena, I'm sure that most of you will have no problem in having you won't have any problem with Sydney-siders in Melbourne. This is kind of a rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, so we'll leave that aside. So when I was coming from Sydney and I saw a sign which said Melbourne this way, it would be utterly stupid of me to stand by and admire the sign. I would never get to Melbourne. Our world today is like that. We are using the sign so much, not realizing what its purpose is. The second purpose of the sign of the creation is, in fact, it's a mirror of ourselves. So when we see the climate change, when we see the global warming matter, the earth having a fever is literally our spirit having a terrible fever. The earth is only suffering because we ourselves are suffering. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second point from the Quran, the holy book in Islam, is referring to our attitude towards the earth attitude towards creation. And God requires us to walk on it lightly and humbly. What does this lightness and humbleness mean? It means that everything is placed in its due proportion and due place. Right now, when we are looking at, as Denise was mentioning, when we look at the environment, and you look at the environment entirely, almost, being pegged to the idea of economy, when you have something like a trade on carbon, we as humanity have a problem. We have a real problem because we don't see things as they are supposed to be in their place. The third idea of corruption, and the Quran mentions, I'll read the passage here, that corruption has appeared throughout the land and the sea due to the hands of what human beings themselves have wrought. So he may let them take a part of this consequence. And so God says that when you are going to be, this almost sounds like a sermon, but I really hope that you don't take it as a sermon. God says that when you are going to be behaving or misbehaving on this earth and actually create corruption, then you will see the consequences of those. And God said that He allows this to actually happen so that we can return to the goodness, or return to a state that human's nature is supposed to be, which will be the fourth point about mending our ways. But before I come to the fourth point, I do want to touch on some signs of our corruption. First is the levels of obesity. And when you have mentioned about the matter of beef, and not only beef, but food, the claim of the Western world, of the first world out there, that we have this industrialized farming to feed the poor of this world is the most dishonest statement about food supply in this world. I don't want to be standing here, particularly in the parliament, and talk about the beautiful things and all have a group hug and go back home in 7 days' time. We need to look at the real problems that are out there. Secondly, the second sign is one of material extravagance. I'll give you an example, and I hope the parliament is not sponsored by the iPhone. If you look at the iPhone, they have just released its 3GS form. I'm only using it as an example because you can apply this to so many other things out there. The 3GS only has certain modifications of application, and its 3G system is a very superior phone. But people don't realize that the new phone that iPhone has created a major problem in trying to get rid of the 3G phone. And the 3G phone has phones have materials in them, I don't know what they are, I'm not a scientist, which cannot be recycled. This is the problem. This is the corruption that Islam speaks of. And I'll come to what the source of the corruption is in a few minutes. Islam presents to us with three ideas against, or the antithesis to, corruption. The first idea is called zuhud. And zuhud means our detachment from the creation, from the material, that we do not in fact have this hoarding attitude. The second is what is called faqr, and that is to do away with what is not needed and not to live in a world of luxuries. If we don't teach our children, my daughter at the moment is having an amazing, I'll call it a dialogue, she calls it debate, that she considers her third pair of shoes her right. And for me to be able to educate her that third pair is in fact a luxury, is only me as a parent. Every one of us are either a parent or a child to somebody. And we need to take a responsibility that our children start to understand what extravagance means. On to the fourth idea, before the fourth idea, here's another quick example of our extravagance and corruption. Do you know, I'm not quite sure about other countries or not, but in Australia, if you had a burglary at your home, and if your burglary did not extend any more than, I think the police figures are $5,000. If your burglary estimation is not more than $5,000, you don't report it. You report it for the purposes of going to the insurance company. The police will most likely not take action in bringing social change about burglary and theft, but simply ask you to go and buy another one. It's okay. And these are the problems we need to grapple with. The fourth idea is that to mend our ways. God does tell us, nor would your Lord be the one to destroy communities for a single wrongdoing, if only its people were to mend its ways. And I want to mention here of what Al Gore had mentioned in its documentary, that when you pray, move your feet. The idea here is that we don't recognize and we don't realize as human beings the power of prayer. If we would only mend our ways and look at issues of corruption and extravagance and things like we have just spoken about, and mend our ways, the synergistic impact from God to change the situation we find ourselves will be incredible. The blessing of God is a forgotten notion in today's world. If we would only mend our ways, things will change. It's not a hope, it's not a dream, it's a reality. The fourth idea is one of capitalism. And I want to read a statement by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who sums this up to me very well. He says, peace be upon him, the likeness of those who uphold the balance laid down by God and those who willfully transgress them is like that of a group of people who draw lots on a boat. In other words, trying to find out which level they will be on this ship. And some of them demand the upper deck, and some of them have no choice but to get the lower deck. When the people on the lower deck want to get water, they have to pass by those who are above them, but they cannot. So the ones on the bottom deck say, let's make a hole in our part of the boat, and then we won't trouble those above us. If the others let them do this, they will all perish. But if they stop them, they will not only save themselves, but save the world. We have to do something, because when we speak of, for example, China producing, it intimates that the government's the problem. And I do agree, governments are a problem. But in this point, we are the problem. Consumerism, consumer extremism, for a Muslim to use the word extremism for somebody else is a little bit of a relief. Consumer extremism is a problem. And we are the extremists in consumerism. So yes, China is producing, America is producing, Australia is producing, but what is Australia? Australia is its people. America is its people. When we say that New York has a low carbon imprint, it's most likely because its footprint is somewhere else. That's why. So the problem here is our own selves, and we need to change our own selves. And I want to sum up by basically quickly mention some ways of our mending. Firstly, we need to return Earth to its rightful status. And what is the rightful status? We would say there are three. Number one, that is of balance. Number two, as Denise quite rightly said, life support system. And number three, it's a sacred space of God, not of Nike, Shell, or United States government. Thank you.